happiest periods of my life, because in the book the denouement really is going to school. Once I went to school, to boarding school at a very young age, that zest for life and security and the feeling of not having to worry, although I was a very anxious and worrying type of child, but that deeper feeling of having not to worry left me. I'd never left my mother before, ever. And at 5½, I went to boarding school. I thought, you know, this is going to be great. Waved goodbye to Mum on the train, from the train, and then suddenly thought, hang on, what's happened? And 10 weeks later, I saw her again. And that really has informed the book, the way that I write it. And I'm as clear as can be on what has happened up until that time. My school years are hazy, and in fact, they're too painful to write about at the moment, and my next book is further on, when I go to sea.
It's interesting, that point, that essentially it's the happiest period of your life, and so that's what puts it in relief, and that's why you've remembered it. I think, and I'm sure everyone would agree, it's full of these gorgeous little happy vignettes. You know, the time he goes to Buckingham Palace, you know, and he leans up against the rails and he ends up with the black paint, and then he's taken into Buckingham Palace and he's cleaned up. I think for me, I mean, and I'm from the UK as well, but it showed us a real kindness that people had. Do you think that people were kinder then? Is that your recollection?
Definitely. I think that people had more time for each other then. And I know that it's not fashionable to denigrate social media, and certainly, obviously, in the company of a young audience like this.
It is for us.
But I think that has destroyed a huge amount of life. I see people at restaurants, for instance, not talking to each other, but using their radios and talking on those. And that...
It's all the same, radios, telephones.
That does really upset me. And in fact, now when I walk along the street, should anyone come close to me, I give an imitation of a ship leaving harbour. I go, lest they bump straight into me. And it doesn't seem to worry them, because they still stand there looking at their radios as I look down at them.
The other thing about the book, Peter, is that writ large in it, of course, is the fact that it's post-war. Do you think that had an impact as well? I mean, you described this, you know, quite bucolic vision of England, you know, sort of these beautiful events that would happen. Was it also because of the war? Was it a nation that was coming together? Do we need that? You know, is it those kind of events that define us and define a nation and create, you know, that kindness that existed when you were a child?
Well, I think that there was definitely a sense of pulling together, and it came across actually in a different context in the Falklands War, when England was sort of gearing up to go down to the Falklands, and especially in the maritime industry, shipping and the wharves and the shipbuilders really pulled together like they hadn't before for a long time. And I think that those sort of things definitely do assist in bringing people together. But you have to remember that there were thousands and thousands of men who never returned, and England was full of widows at that time, my mother being one of them, unfortunately.
And I wanted to address that. So, you know, reading the book for a second time this week, that's what really struck me, was it's full of lots of female characters. You've got your spinsters and widows and grannies and aunts. I mean, I felt there's a real absence of men in your immediate circle as you were growing up. Because, of course, after the war, so many of those men were lost. What kind of an impact do you think that had on you, growing up as a small boy? Did it make you naughtier? Did it make you more responsible?
Certainly didn't make me more responsible. But that, I think, was one of the reasons that my mother sent me, or she was actually persuaded to send us away to school, because in those days, if you could afford it, it was important to go to boarding school. This ridiculous tradition of England, you know, that you send your children away to be educated by someone else. But what I think is important to realise is that, you know, it wasn't so much a case of of one thing or another. It was just a case of being in a position where there was nothing else. My mother wasn't trained for anything. Her father believed that if people could afford to keep their daughters themselves and not have them invade the working force when other people needed work, that they should be basically kept at home and, quotes, kept. No. And I think that that was a serious problem for my mum, even though we did have some male figures. My grandfather on my father's side was certainly someone who was extremely kind, but he died very early in my life. But that was the whole idea of Mum sending us away to school, I think, that we would have a male influence. Now, we all know about what goes on at schools. It's come out in quite vivid detail recently, and going back into the years when I was at school, which was in the late 40s, early 50s. I mean, I was 5 and a half when I went to school. I left boarding school at 18 and went straight to sea. So those sort of things were very, very prevalent then, and I'm not sure that the male role models were the very sort of models that my mother would have wanted.
It's interesting though in the book, you know, I observed at Zen when I was reading it, is you've got all these women in your sort of intimate circle, if you like, but there's lots of male figures in it as well that loom really large, and every time actually you write about a male figure, you do it in capitals. You know, so you've got the monkey man, the old gardener, chief engineer Campbell, you know, and they're all capitalised. Yeah. So what it made me feel is that they loom large, but they're slightly at a distance, they're not in your immediate circle. And it also occurred to me that these are the men that have escaped death, effectively. They either went to the war and came back, or they didn't go to the war for a particular reason. What does their large number in the book mean? I mean, what were these figures to you, these kind of outside of your immediate circle but looming large? What did they represent?
Well, I think they represented my incurable curiosity. I loved talking to people, much to my mother's chagrin. She had a fit if, for instance, I was talking to the log man. The dustman,
capital L.
The log man, the dustman, the fishmonger, the greengrocer, the onion man. The onion man. She was a very aloof person, and the last thing I am is aloof. I love to talk to people, and it's got me into trouble on occasions. But if you don't ask, you never find out. And I've always been curious in that way.
And so that brings me to your mother. You know, I mean, she's the heroine of this book, as far as I was concerned when I read it. You know, she's practical, but she's really doughty, and huge amounts of fun. I mean, I know you said she held you back, but I felt she had a real sense of fun, and she really enjoyed you being who you were. You show her managing, but never really struggling, I felt. What do you think life was like for her?
Well, I think it was very, very difficult. I know that my grandfather assisted her enormously with school fees and things, but she had, not only had she lost her husband, but she had the major problem with a rift in the family, because we were Church of England and my father's family were Catholic, and that was an unassailable rift despite the tragedies of everything. And it was my grandfather who actually obtained dispensation from the Pope for us to be brought up as Church of England as opposed to Catholic. And on my mother's side, my grandmother was a pretty tough sort of woman. I mean, she was very, very wealthy, but she wouldn't let my mother grieve. She said, you know, basically, and I only found this out fairly shortly before my mother died at the age of 90, that basically she just said, you know, there's hundreds of widows. Get on with it. You know, you've got 2 young children, you've just got to get on with it. And I think that Mum never grieved, and that was a real shame. And it was something that affected her very, very much.
A shadow for all those spinsters and
yes.
those widows.
Yeah. Well, the other problem was, of course, that it was very difficult to socialise for widows, because there was a dearth of men in England at that time. And the last thing that the women with their husbands, who were lucky enough to have their husbands, wanted was a single woman floating around the place. So that was something, you know.
So Peter, I'm just going to ask you a last question just to close off. One of the things for me was I sensed a huge sense of nostalgia in the book for the way that things were. What do you see in current times that gives you hope for the future?
I'm hoping that the wheel will start to turn the other way. I think, as I said earlier on, that the fact that there is so little discourse, so little interaction between people is a real tragedy. I mean, you only have to go on the train. Everyone is sitting, reading their radios or whatever they do. If I talk to someone, and I often do talk to people, they look at me as though I'm crazy, you know. And I might be crazy, but I just think that people were given a mouth, and language is a great thing. I love language. And not only in my writing, my professional writing as a lawyer, but also in my other writing, I never, ever abbreviate, not even emails, texts, whatever they are. Never.
We know.
I love them. And I think that's what I'd like to see brought back. More personal interaction between people, and I'm hoping that that may be starting to happen.
You heard it here, you can't abbreviate Peter Murphy. Peter, I feel very privileged to be sitting up on this stage with you, a published author no less. I'm looking forward to getting my signed copy later on tonight. Now I know you've got a few words.